Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here tonight. I appreciate the time as well as the commitment to helping us through this process. Before we get started, I'd just like to start with Nick and go around the room and just do a quick intro to everybody. I'm Gene Richards, Director of Aviation.
Nick Longo, Deputy Director of Aviation.
I'm Diane Carter with the Jones Paint Group.
And I'm Christina Mastrotarian with Jones.
Brandon Robinette with HMMH.
Bob McEwing, ex-airport, representing the town of Essex.
Jesse Baker, City Manager, Winooski.
Kevin Doran, City Manager, South Burlington.
Jonathan DeMore, Chief of Staff of the President's Office at St. Michael's.
Jonathan Prout, and the new Director of Operations here for the airport.
Paul Connor, Director of Planning and Zoning with the City of South Burlington.
Tim McCall, Vice President, Heritage Aviation.
Rick Lazari, Director of Staff, Vermont National Guard.
John Johnston, I'm the Director of Aviation Safety for the Army National Guard.
Erin Disdale, Vermont Small Business Accelerators.
Larry Lackey, Director of Engineering here at the airport.
Bill Creo, Airport Commission.
Dave Link, Link Media.
John Flashman, Assistant Agent Federal Office of the South Burlington School District.
Donna Constantino, concerned citizen of Williston, just outside of the mitigation zone.
I'm Chris Morgan. I'm a resident of Williston in the mitigation zone.
I'm Jim Duncan with the Winooski City Council.
And then on the phone we have Richard Doucette from the Federal Aviation Administration. Richard, if you want to say hello.
Hello.
Hello, Richard.
So I'd like to have Nick jump up and guide you through tonight. And again, I just want to say thank you for being here, and it's been a good process, and I look forward to getting through this phase of it. Go ahead, Nick.
Again, I'll reiterate what Gene said. Thank you very much for coming. New faces as well. We've put a lot of effort, all of you have, in this Technical Advisory Committee to update our noise compatibility program. We are at the back end of it, which is really exciting for us to move this forward, which the next step would be potentially receiving some federal funding to fund some of these programs that we'll talk about tonight, and those programs that we've talked about for just about a year now. Our hope tonight is to, of course, go through the agenda. There is a public comment period next, if anybody from the public would like to speak. Go through the agenda, tell you a little bit about our noise exposure map updates that we just went through, and some of the public comment period and the public hearings that we had. As well as review the city and the Burlington Airport's recommendations for the updated noise compatibility program. We've heard a lot from you as part of the advisory committee. We've heard a lot in writing through the noise exposure map hearings. We've incorporated some of that. We are going to continue to hear from you tonight, of course. And our next step for the noise compatibility program after this meeting is to hold another public hearing and another public comment period on these proposed mitigation efforts. Diane Carter has been our lead on this with the Jones Paint Group. She's going to walk us through this presentation. Please, of course, committee members, please ask questions as we move forward. Again, thank you very much for your time, your efforts, and your commitment to this process. And with that, I think I'm going to open up the public forum for comment, and then I will hand it off to Diane. Is there any member of the public that would like to speak?
I do.
Absolutely, if you can.
In late May, I'm a very sound sleeper. I do social work, and sometimes I work at night. And at 8:30 in the morning, I got woken out of a dead sleep to the F-35s having their little, "Hi, we're visiting." I first was very disoriented. It sounded to me like we were having an earthquake. I went outside. They go right, I don't understand why I'm not in the mitigation zone, because they go right over my house in Williston, right on 2A. And they were far louder than the F-16s ever were. And it's a travesty. And I feel like the quality of life, not only for residents and especially for children, but for the elderly, for anybody, for any of us. I feared for my own hearing. And then going down the line, property values and other concerns. I'm not even going to get into the nuclear component because that's not what this is about, but that is another aspect that upsets me. So I don't understand why the noise ordinance doesn't include my area. So I'm just going to fall through the cracks.
Thank you. Any other members of the public that would like to speak? Seeing none, I'm going to pass this over to Diane so we can walk through the presentation and the recommendations as part of the noise compatibility program.
Thanks, Nick. Well, good evening. For those of you who finally made it, congratulations. We're here at the end of this process. It's exciting. I think it's been a very productive process. It took longer than we anticipated, and I think those changes to take the time to update the map and get some better data on what the anticipated noise exposure is going to be was really helpful in coming to this point so that we could develop a program that would be responsive to all the areas.
Real quick, Diane, if you want to go back, I forgot to mention that's our brand new logo, and we're showing you that tonight. Brand new.
Ta-da! So we're gonna. I'm not going to read this, but we did start every meeting here with our technical advisory committee and what our purposes were. We believe this will probably be our final meeting as we're wrapping up this study. So we wanted to thank everybody for their participation, for being so thoughtful with your comments and your questions, and helping the airport and certainly the consultant team to develop a strong program that we think will provide a lot of opportunities and choices for the people who are affected. This is the 2023 noise exposure map. This is the map that will be used for the mitigation areas, and it is shown as the red lines that circle around the airport. You can see they sort of jig and jog around as the terrain goes up and down around the airport. We've identified all of the noise-sensitive receptors, which includes the healthcare facilities, places of worship, public gathering spaces. We did get comments, particularly from Winooski, to add some additional buildings, and those were added into the final NEM map. That NEM, this noise exposure map, the document that we received will be submitted to the FAA on Monday morning. And we were happy that we had 134 people send in comments about that document, and we'll be working with the airport to release the responses to those comments. All of the comments are contained in the noise exposure map document itself, and that'll be on the website on Monday morning. We did have our open houses on May 29th here at the airport and May 30th in Winooski. They were very well attended, and we hope we were able to answer a lot of people's questions. As I said, the document will be on the BTV Sound website on Monday once it gets submitted to the FAA in Burlington, Massachusetts. They have they have a few months to review and approve. We've been working with the FAA and Richard, who's on the phone here, through the entire process. He's very well connected with the document and has been helping us through it, so we anticipate that review to be fairly quick. We are going to move ahead tonight with finishing up the noise compatibility program. That's the second half of this study, and hope to have a public hearing later in October. We'll talk about that at the end of the meeting. Just a review for the noise exposure map, we looked at a lot of different contour maps to see what the population that was affected, and in the various jurisdictions there are detailed tables in the noise exposure map document that is delineated by jurisdiction and then broken down further by single family or multifamily housing. We just wanted to remind people that the 2015 noise exposure map is the one we had previously, and that was the one that had the full complement of the F-16 aircraft. Our EIS contour was the next one. It had an estimated total of about 2,900 dwelling units. Our 2018 base case noise exposure that we just created was much smaller. It had only 164, but that was because the F-16 drawdown, and so that wasn't a full year of military operations, and so that's why we're going to be using the 2023 noise exposure map, which has about 2,640 dwelling units that are inside the 65 and higher DNL noise contours. So it's comparable, slightly smaller than the EIS contour that was at 2,900. We did see a change in the noise exposure map contour. It came in on the sides and elongated up into Winooski, taking up a fairly large part of Winooski is in the affected area now. And so I think that certainly helped Jesse, representing Winooski, and the people of Winooski to have more involvement in this process as we updated that contour to show that impact. Just a reminder that the goals of the noise compatibility program were to find a way to update mitigation measures. Currently, the airport was doing just land acquisition, buying homes and tearing them down. They wanted to move away from that to provide other types of programs that kept the residential housing here, kept that affordable housing, and kept those neighborhoods intact. And we certainly talked a lot about that over the last year and how important that was, not only for the airport, but for the communities surrounding the airport. And we wanted to make sure that these mitigation recommendations would be funded by the FAA and provide a benefit to the local residents. We talked a lot about the feasibility, how the programs worked, how it impacted residents, what the cost anticipated would be for each of those programs. We'll look at that in our anticipated schedule. So we've come to the end of the process, and we have, this is the recommended program by the airport, and we're looking for your input tonight. There was a technical memorandum sent to everybody that had more detail on that, so I'm not going to belabor each of these. But under the monitoring and review elements, the airport is committing to continue to update their noise exposure maps 1 year after the full operation of the F-35 fighter wing here. We hope that'll be in concert with the DoD, and they're having to update their contours from the EIS. So we're expecting that in 2021. We'll all come back together. We'll give you a year and a half off, and then we'll see you again. And they're also looking to acquire a flight tracking system. This will be able to show the flights in and out of the airport. They'll be able to get information to residents who have questions about what was that plane that just flew over my house, or there was a strange flight pattern, what had happened. So we're going to be recommending that in the NCP, and hopefully they'll be getting funding for that. Under the recommended land use measures, we are going to continue. Oh, hi, Jesse.
Do you want comments as we go, or do you want to go through the whole thing and then go back?
No, I don't have a preference.
I think a comment as we go is going to be great. That way we're all on the same path and on the same set of mind as we go in.
Yes. Yeah, moving on.
So I'm looking at this, the technical document in addition, and it says the city recommends the purchase of. Is that the city would, if funded, the city would purchase it, or recommends that somebody else purchase it?
The city is the city of Burlington. Yeah, so they'll buy the software package. We can put it in the NCP, and then purchasing that system would be an item that would be AIP eligible. They could get a grant for it. The annual maintenance of keeping that software going is not an AIP. It's not AIP fundable, just the purchase of the initial system. So it is for flight tracking only. There is no recommendation for noise monitoring.
So that was going to be my next comment.
Yes.
Is this the place where if there was going to be a request for actual noise monitoring, it would be in this section?
Correct.
So why isn't it being included?
So we had this conversation with CCRPC last night too on some of the pros and cons of a noise monitoring system. Somebody representing the city of South Burlington brought that up as well, and we could put that in there as well. One thing I just want to make sure we're aware of is if we move forward with that, it may impact some of the timeline of some of the other programs. I'm not saying it's a significant cost, and we haven't looked at the schedule of that, but I just want to make sure we as a committee are aware that it may impact the schedule of implementing some of the other programs.
Could you elaborate on that, Nick?
So for example, if the noise monitoring program, I really don't know the cost estimates on this. I'm sure into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. We may receive a grant for that particular monitoring system instead of or in lieu of noise mitigation in the same area.
So,
can I sort of have a follow-up to Jesse's question? Is there a downside to including it as eligible and then having a future decision be made about whether the money should go to home insulation or this? If the decision is that the money should go to home insulation because that's the priority, then it would go to that. Is there a downside to including this in there as a possible thing?
No, I don't think so, but it's definitely going to be an internal conversation at the airport too, because of those maintenance costs and because of how it would be implemented and what the data would be, or how the data would be shared rather, and more importantly, what the purpose of it would be with the FAA. We'd have to have a conversation with the FAA on that as well.
So I guess from our perspective, and share yours, but if to the other decisions that are being made in here about things to not fund are an active decision because the outcome is a not desired outcome of them, purchasing homes, other things, and that there's a choice being made of here's something we would much prefer to do, period, regardless of the amount of money. This seems like something where there may be reasons that it shouldn't be sought for financial reasons, but to take that out as an eligible thing seems premature.
if I could, Richard, if I could ask you the question, if the NCP included a recommendation for a noise and operations system instead of just a flight tracking system, would the airport then be required to make sure the system had both components, or would they be at liberty to just purchase a flight tracking system if that was the decision later down the road?
I'm not sure. I think if you want to keep the option open for noise monitoring, you should make a recommendation, and we can deal with how much it gets, or if it gets funded in the future. I'm not sure if a flight tracking system is eligible for us to use noise mitigation money. I'd have to look into that, but I do know that noise monitors are eligible to use noise mitigation money, so I can look into that.
Okay.
And Nick, I would be, I hear what people are saying, I would be open to leaving it in there, as Paul said, and, you know, not necessarily taking it out. It sounds like there's a want for it, and I think it's important to leave it in there today. And we evaluate the ability to keep it in there. You know, is it affordability? Can the FAA pay for it? Can it be part of it? I think what we need to do is let the program be what the communities want as well, you know what I mean? And so I think I would say if we can leave it in there, let's put it back in, and
okay.
I would make it the most it can be, and then we can see what qualifies and what doesn't. But it's certainly a need and a want, it sounds like, from the communities. So I would say let's leave it in there.
Yeah, I like it.
Okay. We will make that change.
Thank you. I agree with that. Thank you. Just for content or context, if it wasn't in there and you're committing to updating the NEM after a full year of operation of the F-35s, what would that update be an update of? Like, what was the data source that would go into that update?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we would do what we did this time, which is purchase a year's worth of data from the company that collects the radar data and sells it nationally to airports or airlines. That's what we did this time, was was purchased a year's worth of data instead of having it here available every day as the data is collected. Again, it's still, that data is used to develop the track maps, which would be fed into the noise model. So it's not the actual measured data. If noise monitors were put out there, the noise that's measured in the noise monitors in the neighborhoods is not used to make the noise contour. The noise contour still will be made through the noise model, the AEDT, and the noise map combined because of the military. So the noise monitors in the neighborhoods would register a noise level for an event, and you would know how loud it was or how long it lasted, but it would not be used to create a new contour.
And so, just on behalf of my community, would that year of data that was purchased, that the radar data, that's flying patterns but not actual experience? That's sort of correct? And does that also include the afterburner percentage use time?
Brandon?
No, it would. No, I mean it's strictly geographic location data of aircraft activity that occurs throughout the year. The other elements that go into the model would have to be developed through interviewing the Guard and their usage of the aircraft and informed by that kind of process.
Okay.
That we did this, same as we did this time. Any other questions? So we'll change this to an operations and flight tracking monitoring system. So that's great.
Hey, Diane?
Yes?
One other thing I wanted to make people aware of, if they were not aware of it, is in the Department of Defense record of decisions that followed their EIS. They also committed to remodeling the noise after the aircraft arrived. And several months ago, I had a conversation with the Air Force about that. And it is the FAA's expectation that the DoD would participate with the FAA financially, that they would pay for part of the remodeling. Because the Air Force has told us, Air Force in Washington has told us that every aircraft flies a little differently in every location based on a number of local issues, topography, and whatever else factors into their decisions. So that the modeled information we have for the F-35 is, we hope is good, but will be even better is to have real live data from seeing and hearing the F-35s fly. So the next time we do the noise modeling, the Air Force should have even more accurate, updated noise information for the F-35 and how they fly here in Burlington.
Great.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to the land use measures, and I want to just make one correction in the way that I presented the contour bands. I think caused some confusion for people. So when you look at the sound insulation box here, and it talks about the properties located in the 65-70 contour, it should be a comma instead of a dash. So it's the 65 to 70 and the 70 to the 75. Some people thought I was leaving the 70 to the 75 area out, and they weren't going to be eligible for anything. So we'll correct that in our documents that we post on the website so that it's more clear, and we'll reword that in the technical memorandum so that people understand when you see the 65 to 70, the intention was from 65 all the way up to 75. So keep that in mind as we're walking through these land use measures.
Just to be clear, situation with above 75 DNL has not changed, is that correct? So if there's a home above 75, the only allowable mitigation is purchase and demolition. Is that correct, or is that eligible?
Well,
for installation?
one of the things that we are going to work with Richard on, and we're recommending, is that there are a few areas where the 75 contour, we have little bubbles, particularly in the Chamberlain neighborhood, where the 75, it's a little bubble of 75 and it touches the edge of a driveway of a home. And so because it's in the 75, we should offer them land acquisition. But what we'd like to add is if the home is primarily outside the 75 and the homeowner declines acquisition, that they would be eligible for sound insulation. So we're not having someone who's in the middle of a neighborhood with a little tick on the map be required to be acquired and have no other options.
So, but somebody's fully up in the 75.
Correct. They would
only,
need,
they
that's
can't get
their
insulation.
only option.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Paul.
So before we start into the specific questions, before we go too deeply into the specific questions, I wanted to say that the overall of what is being presented here mirrors very closely what the South Burlington City Council requested. And so thank you for all of your work on this. So any questions that we're asking are in the 5%, the 95% fully reflect. So thank you for all your work on that. We very much appreciate this collaborative work.
And ditto for Winooski. Thank you.
So,
having said that,
because it's easy to focus on the little things. So to that exact question in there,
yes.
So two things. One is the way that the language reads. It speaks about the majority of the property being inside or outside. We appreciate that action in there, and wondering to what extent that is how nuanced that is or can be. So my limited understanding of the regulations is that there is some allowance for block rounding, for instance. And so in looking at the context of an entire street, if there's a little blip that happens to cover the driveway or 51% of the property but not the house for a street, and everybody else is going to be retained, our hope and our objective would be that that home is eligible for insulation given its context.
Correct.
And then secondly, you had just indicated that first they'd be offered the buyout, and then if they reject that, then they'd be eligible for the insulation. Is that a mandate under the federal?
Well, we have some chatting we want to do with Richard on this. He has indicated to us that if it's in the 75, the regulation says that we should offer them acquisition, and we're recognizing that. But we also recognize, and Richard has been very helpful in helping us work through some of these unique scenarios where if there is an area where the 75 may touch a property line, but it doesn't touch the house, is that where we could sort of find a way to work around the not around the regulations, but within the regulations to provide sound insulation and not buy a house in the middle of a block and have this weird hole. So you're right, but we haven't had those discussions with the FAA.
So I think that
if I may, Paul,
sorry, go ahead, please.
Just for context, we are talking about 12 properties that are higher than the 75, and really 4 properties, mainly on the Kirby Road, that are really in that bubble, quote unquote. And so that's really where we want to focus on, because the majority of those 12 properties have been offered the acquisition, and they'll continue to be offered, because we know that the majority of that property is higher than the 75.
Right.
Those 4 properties, which kind of leads into your question of block rounding, but possibly, I think, are in the middle of Kirby Road, and while the other ones are not. So we want to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. And on top of that, in 2021, when we revise this map, that area is probably going to see some change within that bubble.
Right, which is part of why we want to make sure that as we're thinking about this, that as you described at the beginning of the process, if and when noise exposure maps are updated, the plan that we're adopting today, or that the city of Burlington is adopting in the near future, will be the effective plan for that time also. So while there's only 4 homes now, it might be 3, it might be 9.
Correct.
Having the policy in place of, said sort of in general lay terms, wherever it's humanly possible to not take the home, that's what we'd like to see happen.
Correct.
I like it.
And the city of Burlington shares that opinion, and thank you for mentioning that the city did take all of the comments they got, not only from South Burlington and Winooski and the school district, but also several, 100 homeowners to try and really incorporate the concerns in keeping this a very community-based program, and not something that is specific to an individual, but benefits the neighborhoods and the communities as a whole. So I'm glad that we were able to have so many things. Whoops. Ooh, sorry. Okay, so land acquisition, we are sticking with that in the 75. There are some homes in there, and we do want to continue to be able to provide an alternative, particularly for those people who have been in the 75. They've declined acquisition, but times change and they may change their mind, and so the airport wants to have that tool in their toolbox. Sound insulation that we've spent lots and lots of time talking about is going to be recommended. It's for the 65 up to the 75, and then again those homes in the 75 where the majority of the property is outside of the 75. No navigation easements will be required.
Is that different than what we had previously talked about?
We had talked about potentially recommending an easement, and then we had looked at different easements and what type of easement we should craft, and the airport, in looking at everything that was sent, decided that they didn't want to require an easement for sound insulation. It's not required. It's not required by the regulations, and so the airport is not going to be including that in the NCP. Yeah, I think that's a big issue, big deal for them. So this is the windows and the doors. There will be some qualifications in order to be able to get this. You have to be acoustically tested, and you have to have an existing interior noise level. Once the NCP gets submitted, we can get into all of the details about how the programs get crafted. We're not going to get into all of that tonight. Those will be the next steps. Thank you, Jean. For us, we're trying to stay on the 50,000 foot level tonight, but there will be much more information about how the programs will be implemented upon approval by the FAA. All of these have to be approved by the FAA. There also are a bunch of community buildings we saw, and those would be eligible for sound insulation as well. So schools and churches and daycare centers and nursing homes. And how those get phased in and when are discussions that the airport will be having moving forward in developing the implementation plan on how to move forward. Any questions about land acquisition or sound insulation? And
can you remind, again, I'm looking back at the technical document.
Mm-hmm.
Can you remind me for the sales, you haven't gotten to sales assistance yet.
Oops, I just want to start all over. So the other two new programs, and we had a lot of discussion about this, is sales assistance and purchase assurance. Sales assistance is the arm's length transaction. The homeowner puts their home for sale on the open market, and someone buys it and moves into the house. The airport will provide incentive to make sure that the seller gets the full market value of the house based on an appraisal, and that there will be an navigation easement attached. That is required by the regulation. So both for sales assistance and purchase assurance, there will be a navigation easement because we have to have that. I know that sales assistance is something that was not supported by South Burlington and some of the other municipalities because they felt the homeowner was getting the benefit and the new owner wouldn't be receiving sound insulation. We looked at that. This is not a program that we feel will have a lot of participation, but we wanted to leave it in there to provide an opportunity for people who may need to sell their home quickly. The airport doesn't have the money to buy it, and if the home potentially has already been tested and is deemed compatible and can't receive sound insulation because it's already quiet in the house, there's a mechanism for them to be able to sell their house and move, and it may help expedite the process. So that's a change from some of the recommendations that came in, but they wanted to leave that in there as an option if they needed it in the future. The program that the airport is more interested in, and that is in line with the recommendations.
I have a question. So then, once if we do, we are able to sell our house and get the fair market value. So the new, if I'm understanding correctly, the new owner will not get any sort of, that makes them ineligible for any of the windows, doors, and stuff?
Correct. So for homeowners, you get to pick one option. You can pick sound insulation once they're approved. This is all the caveat that the FAA approves this. You would have to pick one program. You can't do more than one.
And then the new homeowner is not eligible for any?
Correct. But we're going to talk about the second program,
Oh.
purchase assurance.
Oh, okay.
So that may answer
okay.
your question.
So Dan, just to be clear here, the way that it's written in the language, the home, in order for somebody to make use of the sales assistance program, the only homes that would be eligible are ones that are not eligible for sound insulation.
No, I don't think we want to put that requirement in.
But that's what it reads in here. It says, the city is recommending a sales assistance program for non-compatible land use within
in
the
the
65 and 70 decibel contour where properties are not eligible for sound insulation.
Yes. Sorry.
Is that allowable by the FAA? And Richard, that might be a question for you as well. The question that we're referring to is in sales assistance, can we add language in our NCP to state if the homeowner does not first qualify for sound insulation, can they then qualify for sales assistance? And that's the only way they would qualify for sales assistance.
Yeah, I'd have to talk to our real estate division in Washington to find out because, as you know, we have very, very limited experience with sales assistance programs. There's maybe one or two in the nation that I know of. So I would reach out to my counterpart in Washington to tell me what's eligible and what's not.
Okay. So we can look at that. And I misspoke.
So I think we would advocate for that to be the condition, and that would address this comment here that person, the new person, would not have been eligible to get sound insulation anyway. Yeah. So.
And I would say Christina Mastro Antonio, who's here with me with Jones Payne, was running a sales assistance program down in South Florida that was a combination of an easement or a sales assistance program. And of the 400 homes, I don't think you had any sales assistance. Nobody opted for it. So it's not a very popular program. I don't think we'll see a lot of people, particularly with purchase assurance. So let's talk about that a little bit. So purchase assurance is if you're in the same area and you want to sell your home, you can sell it to the airport. The airport will buy your home and you can move. You do not get relocation expenses. It is not like the land acquisition program because the home is going to remain. So they'll come in, they'll do an appraisal, and they'll make you an offer for that fair market value for your house, and you'll sell your house to the airport. They will record an easement on the property. Then they will sound insulate it, if it's eligible for sound insulation, and sell it on the open market so the new homeowner would get sound insulation. It would be sound insulated when they buy the home. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes.
So.
But I just wonder what, somebody's making money here. Sounds like it's probably the airport.
No, airport doesn't make any money because every dime they get on the sales of things goes back into the noise program. So they can only use this money for noise. So when they buy the house and sell it, that money has to go back into the noise program. They can't use it to build a parking garage or.
Are the taxes refundable from the FAA or the part of the program where we're carrying it?
The taxes.
Like if we buy a property?
That's something we would love to talk to the municipalities about as we move that forward into the implementation plan.
The property taxes. Are they eligible for FAA reimbursement?
Yeah.
Or would the municipalities consider waiving the property taxes during the time of sound insulation construction?
I don't think we have the authority to do it.
Yeah.
We'd look into that. Off the top of my head, we couldn't do it for the educational portion, for sure. The municipal portion, I don't think we could, but we could certainly look into it.
And why I say that is I just don't want people to get the wrong impression, because that's what makes parts of this really challenging for the report to do, because we don't have money, and we have to be really careful what we commit to in this program. So each and every one of those decisions, I will be looking at to make sure that we can afford to participate in the program at that level.
I understand what you're saying, but I would also call out that our two communities in this are extremely different based on grand list. So if you take, I think a penny in your community raises 250,000? About 300,000. A penny in my community raises 50,000. So if you take, say hypothetically 50 Winooski homes could be done in a year, and you're therefore taking $100,000 off my property tax revenue, I have to raise my taxes 2% on all of my property owners.
So I'm not promoting it, I'm just saying we have equal problems, is what I'm trying to say, is like your problem is also my problem. Meaning now you have no way to raise additional income either, without taxing or increasing rates. So I'm just saying I would too have to look at that with my budget, and you would. And I'm not advocating for it, is what I'm trying to say. I'm saying it's, we can put it in there, but we have to really think about what the implications are. Everybody into the municipalities and to the airport.
So I don't think it belongs in this NCP application, but I think once approved, when we're writing the implementation plan, one of the things that I know my council will be looking for on the purchase assurance side is a guarantee of return to market. So between the date of the purchase and the date that the house can return to the market is as narrow a window as possible, which may actually fix this property tax problem.
Exactly.
So again, I don't think it belongs in this application, but just to foreshadow that as something we will be looking for.
I will tell you, sound insulation is a long process. So coming up with some creative ways to sort of expedite things is something we should talk about, because it does. You don't want empty properties sitting there for a variety of reasons.
I want to ask a question on Chris's behalf. The fair market value, is that before this is like a disclosure that you have to, say this is in a noise zone? Is that already taken a property value hit? Or are you basing that on what the value was when it was just under the F-16s?
No, it'll be the appraisal at the time of the sale.
So it's already
so whatever the
taken
market
a hit.
bears at that time.
Right, but it's already taken a hit due to this.
This is a fair market value based on the market itself in the region, not necessarily in the same areas.
When you sell a home, you have to disclose anything that is impacting that home. Right. A seller disclosure. That is part of the process, is already devaluating the property.
We're talking about an actual appraisal on the property that would use the market outside of that zone.
So you're saying if the property were located 50 miles away from the zone but still in the county, you'd be using that value, not the value.
Not necessarily 50 miles.
But 10 miles
Yeah.
outside, way outside the zone. It's whatever that property would fetch elsewhere.
Like Diane said, whatever the market in the region will bear. And we actually have to do a review appraisal as well, a separate review appraisal on that, a third-party review of that first appraisal.
When they do an appraisal, they go to comparables in the community. So you cannot go outside of her area and get a fair a market value, because they have to do a comparable in that neighborhood. So it seems to me like I'm hearing a lot of language about we potentially may get this money from the federal government. We may get. So you're like moving ahead with this process when you don't even know if you have the funds.
Well, we have to put together the plan. Yeah. And then we have to get the FAA to approve the plan.
Yeah.
And they're not going to give the money without the plan. So here we are with a plan. And that's the way these programs
There
work.
never will be a guarantee for the program. It's a government program, and it's based on budgeting and everything else that the government does. So this is, we're facilitating the program on behalf of the FAA for our communities that surround the airport. But we'll start this off by just saying there are no guarantees to the funds. They're there, we're putting the program together with everybody's help, but we may get to it, there could be issues with the government. I believe, this is a priority, for the FAA, that I think they understand the need, and I think what we have to all do is work together and try to build the best program and then advocate for the funding together.
Pardon me if I just can't
Jean-
pull my out.
Gene, would it be a fair statement to say that barring a change in federal policy in Washington about how funds get distributed, that the program being proposed here in the noise compatibility plan and its new priorities we shouldn't expect it to be looked at, if it's accepted by the FAA, any differently than how we've seen funds over the last 15 years. Is that a fair?
I'm very optimistic on the funding based on our history and also the need. I believe this program that we're developing, with the surrounding communities, the new aircraft and the noise, the impact that it has on the communities, that it has a greater need than ever to be fulfilled. Personally, I'm optimistic, but I'm also realistic. The world's a little different right now, and so I'm just saying I don't want anybody to get misled here and say it's a guarantee. Nothing's a guarantee, but I know that when we all work together, great things happen, and I'm very optimistic that this is going to turn out the best that it can turn out.
So I just threw this slide in here to bring everybody back to the discussion we had about how much these individual programs cost and the cost per home on a sound insulation of a home versus sales assistance versus purchase assurance and acquisition. To keep in mind that, as Gina said, the airport doesn't have unlimited funds. And as we start moving forward in developing an implementation plan, this was based on a $5 million grant that might be, I'm not sure if that's high or low, but it's something to be considering as we start thinking about what homes will be participating and how we order the project and schedule these projects. If we have 14 homes in purchase assurance, then we're not sound insulating any homes in that given year. So we'll be looking at that when we start developing our implementation plan.
Diane, I think we'd seen a similar slide to this earlier on, and
Yep.
I thought that the question had been raised of saying the purchase assurance, that's the cost of acquiring the home and then doing the assistance, but then the airport can sell that home back.
Correct.
And the question that I think was going to be looked into was that sale money goes back to the FAA for the noise compatibility program. Can it go directly to this BTV plan?
It goes to BTV.
It seems that maybe that should have a little asterisk next to it to say that 18 months later, perhaps 300,000 of that can come back.
Yep.
And so it becomes a bit of a revolving fund. It's not sunk money as opposed to the acquisition and relocation, which there is
no return.
There is no return.
Yeah.
So it's not really, correct me if I'm wrong, that's not quite, that doesn't tell the whole picture right there.
Well, that's correct. If you're looking at, I agree with you. I only brought this up to think in terms of an annual year. And if the airport had a pot of money, how would they spend the money? But if you're, that's
two
correct.
pots of money.
Yes.
Year 1 is 5 million. Year
Correct.
2 is 5 million. Year 2 or year 3, whatever it is.
Yep.
Some large proportion of the purchase assurance would roll back in, and so year 2 would be actually closer to 8 or 9 million.
Potentially.
Because it's the 5 plus what was
Correct.
recouped.
Yes.
So I guess I'd suggest that.
And that's correct, and that's something we have to look at as we're moving forward. But I don't want everybody to start in year 1 thinking that we're gonna be able to do all of these things in the first year if there were a $5 million grant. We're gonna have to be making some decisions, and as the program matures, we can be looking
I
at
guess
how
my
that
feedback
funding.
is we're all aware that this is gonna be 10 or 20
That's
years worth
correct.
of funding to do all of what we're talking about. And so really presenting this as, that is year one, but then it becomes rolling.
Okay.
And
And
over
there are
time,
some-
that's not
Fair
as
enough.
much of a issue, frankly, to have a purchase assurance versus the other programs.
As we're aware of right now, there are some limitations as well for opening and closing grants that we have obligations to maintain. So year 3, we might be in the process of closing out those grants. So those are definitely some of the things that we need to work on with the FAA on how far that revolving fund, if you will,
Which is in all of our mutual interest to have that turnaround be as fast as humanly possible. So.
That's right.
Well, I would add that in my understanding, in my reading of the plan, that it's not going to be a source of revenue for the airport. It's not going to be a revenue generator. It may offset some future costs related to the program, but it's not going to be a moneymaker for the airport.
No, I just meant that it doesn't
Yeah.
only represent 14 homes.
Right.
It does in year 1, but then you could do 10 homes from that same pot in year 5, and then 7 homes.
That's a good point.
What Tim's saying is that, I'll just reiterate, is that we're administering the program. We're not being reimbursed for that. So it is a liability to the airport to participate in the program. And we have, as a sponsor, that's our job, and we're doing that. And we plan on participating at the highest level with our communities and seeing what we can do to enhance it and make it the best possible program. I think we've always worked really hard to get the biggest bang for our buck, and FAA has been absolutely amazing, with the state in every way. So I would not think that's going to change. I just think what we have to do is figure out what we need, what we can accept, and move on with it as quickly as we can, so we can get this thing working, so that the communities can start benefiting.
So those are the recommendations for the NCP. That's the program that the airport's going to be recommending to the FAA. We are planning on having a public hearing, much like the open house we had in May. We've targeted October 24th as the tentative date. It'll be here, I'm not sure we're here next, yeah. Much like we did last time, we'll be rolling out information to people. We'll have lots of boards and posters so we can talk to people and answer questions. There will be another comment period where people can submit comments. And then we will submit the full NCP by the end of the year to the FAA. They get 180 days to review that NCP and approve or disapprove each individual measure. So that would put it in the June timeframe. Richard's hopeful that maybe it might be a little sooner, so we'll hope he's on the right end of that guess. And as soon as that can get approved sooner, then they can start putting in for grant funds to get the program going.
One process question, one more piece of feedback. On the process, my recollection was that the grant timelines are end of April, beginning of May for each year. Does the timing of this approval affect whether the airport would be able to apply in May of 20?
So generally, we can submit a grant application any time of year that we want. The New England region does have a May 1st deadline typically for all of our grants. We've been working with Richard and some of the FAA staff in New England to prepare for this timeline and potentially apply in the federal fiscal year 2020, which would be next year, by September of next year. That's also under the assumption that this implementation plan is really formed and formulated and agreed to, so that we can all move forward with that detailed plan. But yeah, typically May 1st is our deadline, or the first Monday of May, and but it doesn't stop us from applying for grants anytime.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that before we move on? So, do you need to have the implementation plan done before that grant application, or that grant application can follow pretty quickly?
Technically, we don't need the implementation plan approved before we apply for a grant. But I think it would be in the best interest of a lot of us, the communities, the residents, and certainly the airport, to have the basis of how we're going to implement these and some of the details that we discussed a little bit tonight, especially on the first year, because that first year is really that pilot program to move this forward and start that revolving, I guess, loan or revolving program of designing what we need to do in a house so that the next year we can apply for the grant for construction and so on and so forth. But that first year is going to be critical to make sure we're on the correct path of implementation.
And the grant will have to specify what it is that you want to do. Yeah. So.
And then one last one, I think, about that. I don't see a slide on the options that were not selected in there.
Yes.
So I'll just provide feedback. We understand the airport's reasoning regarding sound barriers. We would like to request a little bit of a modification to the wording in the recommendation, which says the city will not recommend will not recommend the design and development of a sound barrier due to its significant cost and limited effectiveness for the affected area. Could we get a modification in there that spoke of use of FAA NCP funds to do that? So not recommending using this funding source to do that. Such that should some other money from some unrelated thing drop out of the sky and we all feel that it's a good action to take, that there's not a document that's saying we don't ever want to do it under any circumstance.
Well, what will happen is the NCP that we're submitting will not have anything in it for sound barriers. So it doesn't say we don't recommend it. What we will submit is the document that will be submitted will say, here's what we want to do. Land acquisition, sound insulation, sales, purchase, monitoring. It will not say we do not want a sound barrier.
Okay,
so it'll be silent on that.
So if it's silent on the subject, and let's say a philanthropist just drops out of the sky and says, you know what, I'd love to try this thing, and everybody likes it, is there anything in its absence of being here that precludes its construction and installation?
We just have to make sure we go to the DRB.
Might it have an effect on other parts of the community not getting the money if we put that in?
So I'm saying if the funding is totally unrelated, nothing to do with FAA.
No, what I'm saying is that.
No, you're right.
What I'm concerned about is to say, we put one at the north end of the airport. And Kirby Cottage, Kirby Lane down further, qualify. If there's a noise barrier there, it may have implications on those people that they would then qualify for monies because of that barrier.
Even though it was not a FAA funded or...
Still, it's the same thing. It's blocking the noise.
What if the...
Is that correct?
What if the city of Burlington were to extend its mural program in Burlington to do artwork?
I wouldn't get into that.
For instance.
No, absolutely not.
There's a lot of things that okay, I understand the point.
Do you know what I'm saying? Can you explain what I'm...
So...
But what you're... I think that I understand the point, and you're... But the larger point of this doesn't stop a future discussion.
Correct.
That's all I need at this point.
And then the other thing that is not going to be recommended is that the airport is not going to be going out and just buying cash easements. So if somebody doesn't want sound insulation, but they want to sell a navigation easement, and then they get, a couple $1,000 and they go to Jamaica for a week, and then there's no benefit to the community at large because that investment didn't go into the home or the neighborhood, the airport is not going to be recommending navigation easement purchases for noise as part of this program. And those were comments that came
will invest in the properties and the communities.
Did the airport settle yet on what a navigation easement will look like?
We have not.
Okay. The discussion previously had been that there are some examples of other ones in the New England region that should noise exposure maps change, that the navigation easement becomes basically null and void. We really appreciate that where they're not required, they're not being proposed here. Where they are required, we would certainly advocate for that limited easement.
Do you have those copies? Have you already sent them to us?
No, we provided them.
Oh,
You provided them,
okay,
so
great.
yes.
All right. We will.
So yes.
Yes, we will absolutely. We hear what you're saying. We agree.
So a few other additional questions. We started by talking about the NEM process. And I'm assuming that the NEM has to be accepted by the FAA to be the document in effect when this NCP goes into place? Does that have to, if the NEM isn't approved by the end of December, does that throw off this timeline?
No. And I think the NEM will be approved pretty quickly. Richard seems to feel it would be.
Last time we submitted the NEM to Richards in his office in 2015, I think it was a matter of days.
And then in the PDF you sent us, the documents following the recommendations that are dated January 2017.
Those were previous technical memorandums we handed out during the NCP process. And so I just wanted to provide that background material we had already gone over in case people needed a refresher on sound insulation or purchase assurance.
So if there are details in these documents that are not part of what I'm reading as the recommendations, does that mean that they are falling off of the recommendations? Or will these details be incorporated in a future implementation plan or?
In terms of like how the sound insulation process works, yeah, that would be stuff that would come into the implementation.
Okay, so if we have comments on those details, we'll get back together as a group
to work through that.
Work through that as part of the implementation.
I think we're almost there. Any other suggestions, comments, complaints?
Hey, Diane?
Yes. Hi, Richard.
Yes, I'd like to speak a little bit to the approval of the NEM and the NCP. Those two processes are very different. We don't actually approve the NEM, we accept it. And I'm putting air quotes here, which you can't see. The FAA has very limited discretion in reviewing it in NEM. As soon as the NEM comes to my desk, I read it, and if it meets the submittal requirements in the regulations, it can be accepted in that moment. And I put together a Federal Register notice. The notice is published when it goes through the various routing process we have all the way to Washington. But it will be dated the day that I determine that it met the submittal requirements. So it'll be within a matter of days that the NEM gets to my desk, because I assume it'll be good when it gets there, that it'll be valid in a matter of days when it gets to my desk. The NCP is very different. Again, a Federal Register notice has to get its way to Washington. Sometimes it takes a couple of weeks. And that Federal Register notice simply starts another federal 60-day public comment period, which nobody ever notices because we have a lot of local public comment already. Nobody reads the Federal Register and says, oh gee, I think I'll comment on this NCP in Burlington. But the regulations require that we cannot approve it during that 60-day comment period. So that comment period starts when the Federal Register notice is published. So that's probably, if you submit the NCP by the end of December, maybe mid-January when the Federal Register notice for the NCP is published, we sit for 60 days and wait for comments. And then any time after that 60 days, we can approve it. And I have to sit down with the lawyer in our office who I work with, and if we need to, we engage the folks Washington, and this is a bit of a unique program with the sales assistance and purchase assurance program. So we would engage the people in Washington, but I would anticipate we would approve it, and we have to look at each measure and approve or disapprove each one, that we could get that process done within 30 days of the end of the 60 days, so 90 days after it's submitted. So I'm hoping to get an approval of the NCT before May 1, because I don't want the FAA's grant program to slow down whatever grant applications Burlington might want to apply for. So I'm hoping that it'll be ready and done before May 1 of 2020.
Great. That's very exciting. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Is everybody okay with the public hearing on Thursday, October 24th? And you can get back to us as well.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you all
Any
very
last
much.
words? It's our last meeting. I think we've accomplished our goals. I'm so excited.
So I guess this is a Nick question. This will be the last meeting of the Technical Advisory Committee. Do we return to being the sound?
Yeah,
the
well, let me
subset of
pose
us?
that back to you. Do you want to dissolve the Technical Advisory Committee and then reconvene our Sound Mitigation Committee, which will be a quarterly meeting?
I think there's going to be work to do on developing the implementation plan and how
Absolutely.
we're going to stand this all up.
So
So being
whichever is the right
optimistic,
group.
it seems to me that we should, whatever is the right path for you guys to do that.
Okay.
keep doing that.
I'd be comfortable in dissolving the TAC committee and starting the Sound Mitigation Committee, which our primary mission would be that implementation plan.
When would that be, Nick? One of the first?
The TAC meeting, what is it, September? So it would probably be, the Sound Mitigation Committee would be again in December, if not January.
How does that work?
Quarterly from
Can you
there.
just explain to people just what it means? I mean, like, what's the time commitment? What would we expect to do at a meeting, pre-meeting? How is their time going to be used? How can they best give you input and
Sure.
direction?
So prior to starting the TAC meeting, our Sound Mitigation Committee's broad mission was to really talk about any of the sound impacts at the airport, whether it's part of the NCP, which of course is going to be probably more of a conversation than others, operational measures, and a forum for the public to come to offer comments at quarterly. Versus the TAC meeting was specifically to work out the noise compatibility program measures.
So if I can make a recommendation, if the, it sounds like Richard is working hard to try to get the plan approved by May 1st. And a shared objective here is to have an implementation plan. As you said, this is the pilot year, let's get it right.
Yeah.
Presumably we want that in place before you apply for money. I guess, though we've all got a lot of things on our plates, I guess as soon as we can get going with that, if we're done by January and we're all happy about it, then all the better. So I guess I'd say as soon as we can move this forward, whether that means meeting October 25th or whenever, then I think that's what we'd advocate for.
How about we do this? May I suggest, since that's the start of our public comment period, let's reconvene towards, obviously keeping in mind the holiday season, towards the end, beginning of December, so that we can also present those comments that we received to you, as well as start the process of the implementation plan.
Sure.
I do have a question. So I didn't see anything in reviewing the draft NCP that if the 2021 modeling moves the contour lines, what is the intention with respect to any properties that may have already been mitigated to some extent? Is that addressed and I just didn't see it?
As far as changing it, or?
Yeah, is there any reason that those properties shouldn't at least be eligible? I understand that there may be some judgment making at FAA whether to approve grants for properties that have already received some degree of mitigation. But for example, if a property is within whichever contour line where insulation may have made sense, and then it turns out the contour line is moved, or actual testing shows different interior noise levels than when the mitigation was first done, is there any reason that the property shouldn't at least be eligible in the NCP for further mitigation?
Well, no mitigation has been done to date. The only thing the airport has done is purchase homes and then raise them. So there hasn't been any type of sound insulation that's been done before here. So there is no one who's been treated and may get additional treatment or further treatment. That hasn't happened here.
Are
Is that
there
your question?
federal thresholds that follow if there's, for example, an increase of X DNL, that they would be further eligible?
In the future?
In the future?
So typically, and Richard, you can correct me if I'm wrong, typically if you've been provided mitigation, then you've been deemed compatible and you would not be eligible for future mitigation unless the noise increased and the home moved into a 75 DNL contour, and it would then be eligible for acquisition. But, and the line is the line, so if the 65 goes down A Street and on the next map update it moves into blocks, if you aren't inside that line, you're not eligible anymore. So just because you were in a contour at one point, the FAA only funds the currently accepted contour. But if you had sound insulation and the contour changed from the 65 to the 70, would you get more insulation? The answer is no, is my understanding. But Richard, I don't know if you feel differently about that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, in rare occasions, we have acquired homes that were sound insulated years prior, and that's because, like at TF Green Airport in Rhode Island, I think some of that probably happened because they proposed a runway extension, and we're then modeling the noise of new aircraft, more flights from the runway extension. So when something new is proposed that causes a change in noise, it could make people eligible once again. But that certainly wouldn't happen, a couple of years after we had already made the decision and nothing new has happened. If the Air Force comes up with some new, even greater type of aircraft that's much noisier, that would be a type of change. Or if the airport proposed a runway extension and new flights to the South Pole, that would be the type of change. But I would not anticipate any of that.
Does that answer your question, or did we not address it?
It does. I guess the point is that, so at the Chamberlain School, where there is testing done, for eligibility for insulation, as you Nick certainly know, and Diane knows, there is actual testing of interior noise levels to determine eligibility, and the very close margin whether there's sufficient interior noise level exposure to qualify for one category of insulation versus another. And so, if the actual experience is that the new aircraft are going to be louder than the modeling is showing now, right? The 2023 modeling used for the testing that was done, in fact, let's say it's actually louder, and so there's actually greater interior noise that would, putting this a blank slate, qualify for a higher degree of mitigation package than is qualifying now, would there be potential eligibility?
Yeah, I think, Richard, that's a question for you. So the Chamberlain, we're looking to do a positive ventilation because it's tested, below 45. In a future contour, if it were moved into the 70 or it was tested acoustically, could it potentially be eligible for a window replacement? That's the question.
Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely because what the testing proved was that there was inherent sound insulating capacity in the school as its construction. So the only way that determination would change is if the seals break down in the existing windows and the caulk breaks down over time, the then that certainly could change its eligibility. And the other thing that I guess could theoretically happen is if a couple years from now the Air Force comes up with new modeling of the F-35 aircraft and it's considerably noisier, and we test it with those new noise levels, then theoretically, yes, I guess it could be eligible. If the Chamberlain School was very close to being eligible, it was like a tenth of a dB off. So I guess anything's possible. I think even if we did sound insulation, we probably would want to do the positive ventilation at the same time anyway. So I guess the way I would look at it is, if things go really bad, using the school district's way of thinking, the school could still be eligible for sound insulation in the future. And this could almost be the first phase of it if something really goes wrong with the modeling or the construction of the school and how it's built and how long it lasts, et cetera.
Thank you. And is it typical that an NCP is silent on that subject about what happens if there are changing conditions? It doesn't specify one way or the other typically?
Yeah, I think that's a regulatory issue and not a programmatic issue. But I would say for the Chamberlain School, with the positive ventilation package, one of the things that will happen is those unit ventilators are going to come out through the wall, and we're going to be sealing up that opening. So that is going to create an even more of a barrier for the noise to enter through the building, because it's now coming through those little ventilator units. So it's going to change when the testing is redone, if the testing is redone, once the positive ventilation system's put in.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a good point. I remember being on site that there was an obvious weak point in the building for the noise to get in. So even if you just plug those holes, which is going to happen,
yep.
If the F-35 ends up being a lot noisier than people think, and you retest with the higher noise levels, it still might fail because it will have been improved by the installation of the positive ventilation system.
Correct. So we'll have to see. You never know till you do the test.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
Yeah.
Has there ever been a representative from Williston in one of these meetings?
They do have a seat at this committee, as well as the sound mitigation committee.
Are they typically here? Is there typically somebody here?
Yes, typically they've been here. I can get you their name. Okay, well, everybody, thank you for all your time and your patience and your comments and your suggestions. We appreciate it. This has been a really enjoyable process for me, I will say, maybe. And I'm looking forward to getting even more detailed and getting this program going. So thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Don't forget to scan your parking ticket before you leave.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.